Today I want to discuss a little bit the letter Gimel and the relationship between English G and the letter Gimel in Hebrew. And the first question I think a lot of people ask themselves, those who especially were not born in America and come and they have to learn how to pronounce various words, why is it that sometimes the letter G in English is pronounced as J sound, the same as J, and sometimes like G sound, which is the sound that's a much more common one, right? In most European languages, there is a G sound, but there isn't always a J sound. But in English, we seem to have two J sounds. One is letter J, of course, and the other is sometimes letter G. So people think there is a simple rule depending on which vowel follows the G. That's the main litmus test of how to pronounce it. Sometimes we pronounce it as G, sometimes as J, depending on what's the vowel. The truth is it's a far more complicated story here, which I'm not going to go into. It has to do with where the words come from, and it has to do with French influence. But whatever the case may be, one thing for certain is that in English, the same letter is pronounced as two completely different sounds. Think about it. J and G are not even similar. In fact, in Hebrew, our ancient sources, Sefer Yetzirah, for instance, in Zohar, divide all the letters into 5 categories, depending on where in the mouth, which part of the mouth is used to pronounce them. So guess what? J would, if ever, the truth is there is no J, except in Yemenite pronunciation, which I'll get to in a moment. But the J sound would be kind of a combination between Z and J, that kind of thing. So that's together with letters T, D, right, is in one part of the mouth. The G sound, however, is in a completely different place. The G will come together with the K and H and those sounds. So one would not obviously see any connection at all between J and G. But it happens to be that the English is not the only language where there is some connection. In case of English, of course, the same letter that's pronounced as J and G, depending on various circumstances. But to the extent that I don't know Arabic at all, but from what I know and what I've seen mentioned, it's apparently depending on the accent, depending on which Arabic it is. There's a letter that could be J or G. So here's another language in which there is some connection. So this leads me to the pronunciation of Gimel with Dagesh by Yemenite Jews. Very interesting question. It's known that Yemenite Jews have the most unusual pronunciation of various letters, both consonants and vowels. But in particular, Yemenite Jews distinguish the dot inside the Hebrew letter, which we call Dagesh. There's a different dot that sometimes in certain letters, mostly in Hey, that's called Mapik. But I'm discussing Dagesh. There are 2 types of Dageshim. The Dagesh that makes the letter sound like a double. In most languages, we don't really notice this when certain words are spelled with a double letter. Like in certain English words, there are 2 M's, 2 N's in a row, 2 S's in a row. But I don't know if anybody distinguishes the pronunciation. You just have to remember, some words are spelled with 2 S's, some with 1 S. The same is true in Russian. I was born in the Soviet Union almost 50 years ago, so we also had to memorize all these words, which ones have 2 S's, which ones have 2 N's. In Hebrew, the same thing is accomplished by a dot inside the letter. That's called the Dagesh Chazak, a strong Dagesh. It basically doubles the letter. By the way, interestingly, the word Yisachar, or Yisachar as we pronounce it when we read the Torah, that name, in fact, in English is spelled with 2 S's, and in Hebrew is spelled with 2 sins. That's like an exclusion. This is very unusual. Normally, like I said, 2 of the same letters are not used in Hebrew to just double a letter. It's just a letter with a Dagesh is used. But here, one letter is in a way not pronounced, but in fact, in other languages, this name Yisachar is written with 2 S's. But in Hebrew, this is an exception to the rule. And in fact, there are some communities that pronounce it as Yisachar, not Yisachar, Yisachar. They actually pronounce 2 letters. But anyway, normally in Hebrew, the doubles are accomplished by a Dagesh Chazak. And then there's a different type of Dagesh, what's called a light Dagesh, a soft Dagesh, and that Dagesh is only accepted by certain letters. Usually, it's considered in grammar that 6 letters can receive that Dagesh. However, there's a 7th letter that may have, in some dialects in the ancient times, received the Dagesh, the Reish. The Sefer Yetzirah, an ancient book, Kabbalistic book, claims that Reish is also one of the letters that can receive that type of Dagesh. One of the possibilities is that the difference was between R and the H kind of sound with an extra H. There are certain letters that an H kind of makes it a somewhat different letter. Notice, for instance, in English, PH is pronounced as F. Guess what? In Hebrew, P without Dagesh is F. So PH is a kind of F sound. So Reish H kind of was a kind of Reish without Dagesh probably in the ancient pronunciation. But whatever the case may be, today we don't have that. We don't pronounce Reish without Dagesh, and in fact Reish is always without Dagesh. But with very, very few exceptions where Reish may have in the entire Bible a few times that Reish has a Dagesh Chazak. So what's left is 6 letters. What are those letters? B, which in pronunciations of most Jews becomes V sound without Dagesh, Bet Vet. But there are some Sephardi Jews that pronounce it the same. They pronounce Bet without Dagesh the same way as Bet with Dagesh. Then there is Gimel. Most Jews pronounce Gimel today with and without Dagesh the same exact way. It's just G sound. Then there's Dalet. Most Jews, again, pronounce it the same, whether it's with Dagesh or without Dagesh, but some pronunciations, including Yemenite Jews, have a difference between D and the sound. Dalet without Dagesh becomes the. Then there is Kaf, which without Dagesh becomes Chaf, K, Ch. Then there is Pei, without Dagesh becomes Fei, P, F. I already discussed it in English. There is somewhat remainder of something similar with PH becoming a F sound. And at last, Tav, which without Dagesh by Yemenite Jews becomes Th. It's kind of symmetric. D becomes the, T becomes Th. But in Ashkenazi pronunciation, Tav without Dagesh becomes S. Possibly because in most European languages, except English, there is no Th sound. So it becomes like in German, where most Jews live, right? It becomes, the Th kind of becomes S. So that's why you often see Hebrew words like Shabbos, Shabbat, right? It's the same word, but the pronunciation of European Jews, Ashkenazic Jews, is Shabbos because it's the Tav without Dagesh that becomes a kind of Th, in English Sabbath, and then already in Germanic languages would be closer to S sound, Shabbos, Shabbat, Shabbos. Anyway, so I'm coming back to the Gimel now. I specifically did not want to discuss the Gimel without Dagesh and with the Dagesh, what the difference is. I discussed all the others. So Bet and Vet are distinguished by most communities, except some Syrian and other Sephardi Jews. The Gimel, I will get to. Dalet is distinguished mostly today by Yemenites, maybe some other Sephardim also. It's mentioned in the books of Sephardi Jews that they used to distinguish Dalet without Dagesh to make it a the sound. Tav is distinguished by Ashkenazim and some Sephardim. Pei and Fei is distinguished almost by everyone. And Kaf and Chaf also, everybody distinguishes Kaf with Dagesh, Chaf without Dagesh. So we're left with Gimel. How is Gimel pronounced without Dagesh by those who distinguish it? So there are 2 approaches here. One, the most common approach among those Sephardim who distinguish, a lot of Syrian Jews distinguish this way. They say that Gimel without Dagesh is pronounced as a kind of R sound, closer to French R. The French R, by the way, today's Israelis pronounce Reish that way, but really the ancient Reish was probably closer to the way the Spanish, the German, the Russian people pronounce it, not like English R, but R. So that's the real Reish. But the Gimel without Dagesh, that's closer to the Israeli Reish today, or to the French R. R. Now notice again the similarity. The K becomes Ch without Dagesh, and the G becomes G. K, Ch, G, R. Right? All of these are symmetric to each other. By the way, the last couple is Beit, Veit, Pei, Fei, also B, V, P, F. Notice all these cases where basically 2 letters, when they're more soft sounding, then their pair without Dagesh is also corresponding. If bet becomes vet without dagesh, then pei becomes fei without dagesh. B, p, v, f. Anyway, so coming back to Gimel, there's a different way though that Yemenite Jews pronounce it when it's with a dagesh. When it's without dagesh, they pronounce it like most other Jews, like a regular g, not like g. But with dagesh, they pronounce it like j sound. Maybe it has to do with peculiarities of particular Arabic. I'm not an expert in that, but of course the Yemenite Jews spoke Arabic as one of their native languages besides Hebrew and Aramaic, and it's very possible that it had influence on the accent. But whatever the case may be, they pronounce Gimel with the dagesh as j, Gimel. So in Shmona Esrei, for instance, not ata gibor, ata jibor leolam Hashem. So that's the interesting thing about the g and j, which I want to discuss in various languages, including the Yemenite Hebrew, the same as in a way in English, except that in English, of course, there is no dot to tell us which way to read the G sound. Is it G or is it J? Is it a J? Is it G or is it J in this in every particular word? But in Hebrew, if it's written with all the dots, then we'll know for Yemenite Jews whether it's a J or a G sound. And if you like this video, please press like and please subscribe to our channel.